We are so fortunate tonight to have Charles Murray as our speaker. He is a political scientist, author, and libertarian. He first came to national attention in 1984 with the very popular publication of Losing Ground, which has been credited as the intellectual foundation for the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. He has written several bestsellers, including his most recent book, Coming Apart, which describes an unprecedented divergence in American classes over the last half-century. He served as a panelist at our Atlanta Free Market Forum in 2011, and his presentation at the forum at that time is in one of our Imprimis issues, and you may pick one of those up out at the literature tables in the foyer. Dr. Murray has a BA in history from Harvard and a PhD in political science from MIT. Would you join me in welcoming, please, Dr. Charles Murray.
Thanks very much. It's not just the Atlanta Forum that is my history with Hillsdale. I've been speaking at Hillsdale on and off, I guess now, since a few years after Losing Ground came out, plus some off-site events as well, and it's always a great pleasure to be back. I want to start by making a request of the audience, especially since there are so many professors in the audience. During the course of my presentation, occasionally you will have come into your head the thought, what are the policy implications of what he is saying? I want you to suppress that thought. There are no policy implications to what I'm going to say tonight. I know that's a heretical statement because we are supposed to always have solutions to problems. And if I were made Tsar of the United States, I could then impose some libertarian solutions, which I think would make a difference. But that's not going to happen. We do not have a situation in which any politically feasible legislation is going to make much difference to the problems I'm going to talk about. The solutions, if there are ones, are going to have to be cultural. Because of that, it's probably best just to concentrate on the description of the problem I'm talking about, and we can get to solutions at a later date. The thesis of Coming Apart is very simple, that we have seen over the last half-century the emergence of classes in this country that are different in kind from anything we have known before. We have always had rich people and poor people. That's not new. They have always lived in somewhat different parts of town. They've had somewhat different habits and mores. But one of the characteristics of the United States that made it exceptional was this very strong sense, a visceral sense among Americans that we were all Americans together. Tocqueville, in writing in the 1830s, has a wonderful paragraph where he talks about the opulent members of society take great care not to separate themselves from the lower classes. They talk to them every day. It is reflected in public opinion polls in the United States where people who obviously are not middle class, they're much richer and better educated and more powerful than that, say, oh yeah, I'm just middle class. It has been manifested historically in the great pride that the most successful members of society took in being members of the fraternal organizations that drew their membership across social classes. And as I look around the audience here, where there's an age demographic not that different from mine, I think a lot of you know what such phrases as getting too big for your britches means. There are lots of ways in which, even though there was economic inequality and different classes, that you were an American in some fundamental way that transcended that. And what I'm saying tonight is that's going. Not gone altogether, it's going. In the book, I spend a considerable amount of time describing the formation of a new lower class and the formation of a new upper class. This is not going to be a full-scale lecture tonight, and so I'm going to cut some corners. I am going to skip lightly over the formation of the new lower class and concentrate on the formation of the new upper class because, let's face it, a lot of the issues associated with the new upper class are ones which are relevant to people in this room and especially to our children. But start with the new lower class. I'm going to give you some statistics, not a whole lot, but some, and they are going to be quite limited. I'm going to be talking about non-Latino whites between the ages of 30 and 49. Why am I doing that? Because it gets rid of a whole lot of baggage. So that if I'm talking about numbers which talk about problems, it is completely natural for someone to say, well, to what extent are these problems associated with the black community or the Latino community or some minority? To what extent are these national problems? When you're talking about non-Latino whites ages 30 to 49, you're talking about people in the prime of life who don't have any good excuses. All right, let's start out with marriage. Marriage is probably the most fundamental social institution there is. It has collateral effects that go deep into all kinds of cultural phenomena. It used to be virtually universal. As of 1960, ages 30 to 49, non-Latino whites, those in the upper middle class, defined as people with college educations and working in the professions or in a managerial position, were married at the rate of 94%. That's about as close to total participation as you can have in any social institution. But if you take the white working class, with working class defined as a high school education, working in a blue-collar or a low-level service job, 84% were married. Not quite as high, but it was the overwhelming norm by which working class communities were organized. Skip ahead 50 years to 2010. You've heard all the stories about the decline of marriage, the rise of the divorce, the rise of out-of-wedlock births, and all the rest of it. In the white upper middle class, 84% were married as of 2010. There had been a reduction, but most of that had occurred in the 60s and 70s. That number has been stable since the 1980s, and furthermore, divorce has been going down, so that 84% represents a whole lot of first and only marriages. Marriage is alive and well in the upper middle class. White working class, 2010, 48% married. From 84% to 48% in 50 years is a phenomenally rapid change in a fundamental social institution. Why is that important? Well, a whole lot of reasons. One of them has to do with social capital. The social capital referring to all the ways in which communities work, whether it's parents trying to get a four-way stop sign near where their kids are playing, or attending PTA meetings, or coaching Little League teams, or participating in fund drives and all the rest of that. It's married couples who do that. Unmarried dads do not coach Little League teams. Unmarried moms don't attend PTA meetings at nearly the rate that married moms do, if for no other reason they don't have the time. Social capital is radically diminished when you have a decline in marriage, and social capital that makes communities work. The effects on male performance in the labor force is huge when marriage goes down. One of the triumphs of modern social science is that after a great deal of statistical analysis, it has been determined that marriage civilizes men. This is a big surprise. There's a thing called the marriage premium, whereby men who are married get much more productive. I'm serious. The economists have been arguing about this, what does this mean? Is this, is it what's cause, what's an effect, and so forth and so on. Come on. Guys get married, they settle down, they get focused, they go to work. But they aren't married, they aren't that way. Who did not know that except academics? But the fact is that along with the decline in marriage in the working class, here's what's happened to male labor force participation. Labor force participation means either you have a job or you are looking for a job. And as of 1960, if you were a male ages 30 to 49 and you were not working or looking for a job, you were a bum. You were a bum according to your girlfriend, according to your parents, according to your neighbors. Everybody thought you were, and they were not shy about letting you know that. And guess what? As a result, unless you were paraplegic, you were in the labor force. 1960 to 2008 this time, not 2010, because I want to get a number that comes before the recession set in. So in 2008, among white males ages 30 to 49, 1 out of 8 was not even in the labor force. And if you think that's a function of, gee, there are no good unionized jobs anymore, the economy's terrible, we had a natural experiment in the last half of the 1990s whereby there was a period of about 4 or 5 years when you could get jobs way above the minimum wage for as many hours as you wanted to work easily. And white males did not come flocking back into the labor force then. This rise has been gradual. It reflects a cultural change in the attitude toward work that is profoundly troubling. I could go on at more length, but what I'm really saying, and because I do want to shift to the new upper class, is that there has been a kind of cultural change within the working class which has led large numbers of people to drop out. They no longer participate in the institutions of American life in the way that they formerly did, and the kind of glue that has held us together as a society has weakened accordingly. Okay, let's talk about the new upper class. Don't confuse this with the upper middle class. Now I'm talking about the elites. It's not the 1% versus the 99%. I'm not talking about income inequality. I'm talking about the people who run the country. And by run the country, I mean, yes, politically, but I also mean run the economy and run the culture. So the new upper class includes the senior government officials in Washington, yes. It also includes the most influential people in the financial world in New York City. It includes the people who run the major media outlets in New York and Washington, D.C., news outlets. It includes the people who write for sitcoms, who produce the content of the entertainment media. And it includes people in Silicon Valley as well. These are the folks whose behavior and actions and the rest of it do things to the culture that shape it. It's a pretty small group. Probably if you're thinking about the narrow elite, the people who have national influence, it's probably not even 100,000 people. You can also talk about a broader elite, of which many of you are members, which is the people who are influential in the culture, politics, and the economy of the cities in which you live. Over the last 50 years, we have seen a separation of that group from the rest of society as well. It has been driven by a couple of phenomena that are good in themselves, but that had collateral effects. There were 2 of them. First, over the course of the 20th century, brains became worth a whole lot more money in the marketplace. Just plain old, raw, intellectual power. And to illustrate that, let me give you an example. I'm going to be describing a person that almost all of you have met. This is a person with terrific math ability, or terrific visual spatial skills, who you would not trust to go across the street and buy you a loaf of bread, and who has no interpersonal skills whatsoever. What could that person do in 1920? Be an actuary? You know, he couldn't even be a math professor very easily if he had no interpersonal skills whatsoever. What can a person with precisely that same skill set do today? He can juggle competing 6-figure offers from firms in Silicon Valley for his programming talents, because the talents I've just described are very important in becoming a brilliant programmer. If he's really a terrific pure mathematician, he can be juggling offers from the quant funds in New York City that can offer him dreams beyond the wildest dreams of avarice, wealth beyond the wildest dreams of avarice. But it's not just those peculiar kinds of skills that have become more valuable in the marketplace. Think about, for example, an attorney. If it's 1920 and you're an attorney, you are probably one of the more affluent people in town. You make a good income, but you aren't really rich, because the kinds of money you get paid if you're an attorney in 1920 are the kinds of fees that private people having legal issues can afford to pay. What kind of money can you make if you are a brilliant attorney today? If you can negotiate a favorable ruling by a regulatory agency in Washington that affects a corporation's bottom line by $1 billion, you are worth 4 figures an hour, easy. If you can negotiate these incredibly complex international mergers of corporations, you can be worth a commission of a couple of $1 million. And it's not just being a lawyer and having a law degree, it's having the intellectual ability to do these complex things. Same thing happened throughout the economy. What are you worth if you are Don Draper, for those of you who watch Mad Men? If you are Don Draper and you have a track record of being able to increase through your advertising campaign the market share of your client by 1%. Well, if your client has annual sales of $20 million, you're worth one amount. If your client has annual sales of $20 billion, you are worth a whole lot more. So, okay, this is fine. People are getting paid for real contributions that are worth that in the marketplace. But now conjoin that with a second trend that went on in the 20th century. Again, a good thing, which is that we got a whole lot better at taking the very smartest kids, wherever they came from, whatever their background was, and shipping them off to the best colleges. It happened during the 1950s. That was really the critical decade. It continued into the 60s and 70s. But I'll give you an example. My alma mater is Harvard University. In 1952, the mean SAT score, verbal, of entering Harvard freshmen was 583. If you have a child with an SAT verbal score of 583, I do not recommend that he apply to Harvard. That's not even in the ballpark. By 1960, which was just 8 years later, that mean SAT verbal score was about 680. The average Harvard freshman in 1952 would have been in the bottom 10% of the class by 1960. That same phenomenon went on throughout the educational system. As colleges throughout the country there was a cognitive stratification that went on. This is part of the American dream, that if you have talent in this country and can work hard or willing to work hard, you will get a chance to realize that. But there were side effects. You were bringing together on college campuses a whole lot of really smart kids who were then going out into the world and making a whole lot of money because of the increased value of brains. The socialization that goes on in that kind of situation, with that kind of homogeneity of background, is way different from the kind of socialization of the upper classes before. Here's an example. In 1960, there were already neighborhoods in this country which were very well known as the place that the powerful rich people lived. Upper East Side of New York, Lower Westchester County, North Shore of Chicago, Beverly Hills and Bel Air, Burlingame out in south of San Francisco, those kinds of places. I collected data on 14 of those rich and famous and powerful towns using 1960 census data, and I calculated two numbers. One was the median family income, and the other was the percentage of adults with college degrees. Want to know what the median family income on the Upper East Side of New York was in 1960? Answer, $55,000. That's expressed in 2010 dollars. That's not affluence. That doesn't mean that there were not rich people living in the Upper East Side. They were a very small minority of the total people living there. Overall, with the 14 neighborhoods I chose in 1960, the median family income was, I think, $64,000 over all of them. And the median percentage of people with college degrees was 26%. Now, that latter that latter statistic means what was the typical married couple, living in Scarsdale, living in Winnetka, Illinois? It was probably the guy had a college degree, probably just a BA, and the wife had a high school diploma. That was normal. And within Winnetka or within Scarsdale, you had a whole lot of people who weren't rich and well-educated at all. You had a great deal of heterogeneity. You go back to those same 14 neighborhoods as of the 2000 census, the median family income was up to $164,000 in constant dollars, and you now had about 76% with college degrees, but much more than that. A whole lot of those were not only both members of the couple with college degrees, but both with advanced degrees, and a great many of them coming from the elite colleges. The result of that has been some bubbles that have formed, and the biggest bubbles have been formed in those parts of the country where the most powerful people live. In Northwest Washington, D.C., those of you who know Washington, D.C. know the following, that if you hold power in Washington, D.C., you live in Northwest Washington or the adjacent suburbs of Maryland and Virginia. It's basically about 13 zip codes that form the place where almost everybody who's a mover and shaker in Washington lives. I calculated an index combining education and income and ranked every zip code in the country on that index. Out of the 13 zip codes which hold most of these people, 11 were not just in the 99th percentile, 11 of the 13 were in the top half of the 99th percentile, and the other 2 were in the 98th percentile and the lower half of the 99th percentile. Overall, around Washington, D.C., you now have contiguous zip codes of more than 1 million people that are in the top 5 percentiles on this index of education and wealth. What that means is that you have the next generation growing up in a bubble in which they can live without ever coming into contact with the real America. And the same thing is true of New York City, of Los Angeles, California, and Silicon Valley. What does this mean? Well, this is where I think a lot of people in the room know exactly what I'm going to talk about, which is that it's one thing to have become successful in life if you've grown up in a working class or middle class neighborhood. You remember what it was like. It's another thing to have grown up going K-12 schools, either private or really good public schools, in which the dumbest kid in the class is probably at the 70th percentile of the national distribution of IQ. You go from those to a nice college, sometimes a selective college, often an elite college. You spend your summers with internships at places like AEI or Brookings or others where you are again surrounded by people just like you. And you go from there to graduate school or law school where you move seamlessly into a good career and you never come in contact with anybody else. As I wrote the book, I was trying to figure out a way to get my readers to realize how isolated they were. And so I created a quiz. It has 25 items. You can get a maximum of 100 points. And I said to myself, well, I want my readers to prove to themselves that what I'm saying is correct. Now, some of the questions in the quiz were good social science questions, such as, have you ever lived for at least a year in the course of your life in a neighborhood in which fewer than half of the people had college degrees? Have you ever lived for at least a year in a neighborhood below the poverty line? So forth. Some of my other questions were a little mischievous. Have you or your spouse ever purchased a pickup truck? Have you or your spouse ever stocked the fridge with a mass market American beer? I asked that question because the new upper class despises Bud and Coors and Miller and Light. Don't even ask about Light, Miller Light. You know, their beers are a perfect shade of deep amber made by Belgian elves. And they will talk about these at great length, too. If I had to say to myself, what are the most important questions in the quiz, one of them was, have you ever walked on a factory floor? I didn't even say worked. I said walked. Everything that we wear, everything that we use is made in a factory. What does it say about what you know about the world if you've never even seen what a factory floor looks like? And the other question I think is crucially important is, have you ever held a job that caused a body part to hurt at the end of the day? Carpal tunnel syndrome does not count. If you have never held such a job, it is fundamentally impossible for you to empathize with the very large number of people who hold that kind of job every day. You have no idea what it's like. Well, I think that the quiz accomplished its purpose. It was actually put up, I did a segment for the NewsHour on public television, and they put it up on their website, and more than 250,000 people have taken the test. And I have also found at AEI, when I tried out the test on the younger members of AEI, I was really happy to hear that people who got high scores, which means they weren't in a bubble, were high-fiving each other, and people who got low scores were unhappy. Somebody pointed out to me that I might be jumping to conclusions here because kids at AEI want to get a high score on a test no matter what the test is. So, you know. But I think the point may have gotten across to them, but that doesn't put aside a real problem that we have as a society, which is increasingly the people who run the country haven't a clue about how ordinary America works. And there's an asymmetry here. If a truck driver does not empathize with the priorities of a cabinet secretary, that's not too important because the truck driver cannot mess up the cabinet secretary's life. The cabinet secretary can mess up the truck driver's life by not understanding what his priorities are. Furthermore, another kind of problem has infected the new upper class, which makes me worry about the future even more. Historically, and I'm drawing on Arnold Toynbee for this, historically cultures have been led by a confident elite, confident in their own values, willing to express those values, proclaim those values as being the right way to live, and the rest of society has followed along. And I think that Toynbee was right in saying this has been a characteristic of vibrant, growing civilizations. That stopped in the United States. Among the new upper class that I'm talking about, the reigning value now is non-judgmentalism. So that, well, yes, I'm married. Yes, we had our children within wedlock. Yes, we do A, B, C, other kinds of things. But who are we to say that other people should do the same thing? The new upper class will not preach what it practices. Now, I use that phrase in the book, and I've caught a lot of flack because I think people have the sense that I want them to go down to a street corner in a working class neighborhood with a bullhorn, and that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm saying I want it to be in the air that certain kinds of standards, of virtues, are a good way to live, a way that has worked for the people who practice them, and that also have a moral foundation that they think is worthy of allegiance. And that kind of conversation has almost disappeared. Now, I can't stop without saying, all right, what do we do next? As I said at the beginning, public policy does not have any answers for us. Here is a truth, however, about American society's history, which is we have had cultural great awakenings. And they have occurred very rapidly. They have, the main ones we know about are the religious great awakenings. There are 3 or 4 of them, depending on which historian you're reading, but those religious great awakenings had enormous impact on subsequent American history. The first Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s shaped the revolutionary generation. The second Great Awakening in the 1820s shaped abolitionism, shaped all sorts of other kinds of educational trends, also cut the alcohol consumption of Americans by some incredible amount. The third Great Awakening in the 1870s and 80s was the precursor of the Progressive era. These Great Awakenings have occurred unplanned, spontaneously. They've had enormous impact. The reaction I have gotten to the kinds of things I've been saying tonight suggests to me that in many ways I am saying things that people in my audiences have already been thinking about, and that there is a latent responsiveness to the kinds of cultural resuscitation that we need. That does not let me tell you exactly how it's going to occur. I'm only saying that it is not completely unreasonable to hope for it. I guess the message of the book is not about what we do wholesale, it's what we do retail. And by retail, I mean that each of us as parents think about the way we live our lives. You know, do we want to isolate our children from the great diversity of Americans out there? Do we want to live in isolated enclaves filled with people just like ourselves? Is that good for our kids? The question I ask oftentimes is, think, and when I'm speaking to an audience that's adult, think of the things that have made you successful in your life. To what extent are you systematically depriving your children of those same opportunities? Insofar as I get a good response to that, and I do get a good response, I think there is hope. The alternative is that the United States will continue to be successful economically, we will continue to be powerful internationally, but we will have lost those things that have made this country exceptional. A civic culture, a way of living together that has been unique among the nations of the earth and immeasurably precious. Thank you very much. We have questions. And by the way, Anita, at some point I'm going to rely on you to say we have time for one more question because I lose track of time. Okay? Okay. Yes, sir. And we'll have a mic coming down. It's coming down the aisle right now. Right behind you there.
I lived in a small town. I say small town, probably not so small. It was 4 miles from New York City, Teaneck. And I think it was a very integrated. And it was integrated because of the school system. It had 7 grammar schools, but it had 1 high school where all the grammar schools came together. Now, the individual grammar schools had different economical situations, but we were all blended together in 1 high school. And I think that was part of the success of our country, where there was a school system that blended our younger people together. I wonder what you have to say to that.
Well, I had exactly the same experience you had. We had separate grade schools where I grew up, but we had 1 high school. Sir, what I've been trying to say to parents about this is you are way overestimating the importance of K-12 education for your kids in terms of how much they learn, as long as they're going to a reasonably okay school. I went to Harvard from Newton, Iowa, and Newton, Iowa schools weren't particularly good. Was I behind the kids from Exeter and Andover when I got there? Sure I was. But what Harvard said, and was true, is these kids from these mediocre public schools catch up in about a year. And also, I went to Harvard absolutely ecstatic and excited about what I was doing, whereas the kids from Exeter and Andover were pretty jaded. The lesson here is, I think, and I've acted on this in my own life, I think it's much more important for your children to be raised among a widely diverse set of people and have to cope with all of the range of situations that presents than it is that you maximize the amount learned per hour spent in school. And if you take my advice, not only do I think your children will turn out better, you're going to save about 30 grand a year. So, right here, sir. And then I'll go back toward the back there.
It's a privilege to get to speak with you after I put your book down. I couldn't help but wonder what's going to happen to us. And my question is it reasonable to think with this kind of demographic that we can make the system that we know and love continue to work? I picture in my mind's eye Madison and Hamilton talking, and Madison says, these guys are pretty flaky, Alex. Do you really think they can make the system work? How about it?
Well, I would start out by blaming Alexander Hamilton for a lot of our problems. Since the Supreme Court in 1937 said Hamilton was right and Madison was wrong in a very important decision. Well, I will refer to my next book, the one I'm working on right now, which is, and I think that limited government, constitutional limited government, is dead. That it's not going to be resuscitated because we get 2 or 3 more conservative justices in the Supreme Court. It's not going to be resuscitated because we win both houses of Congress and win the presidency. I think that there are systemic things in the regulatory state which means that you cannot reverse that through the political process. However, and I'm just going to give this as a teaser, all right? Number one, I think the openings for federalism are really growing. That there are all sorts of ways in which people in different states are saying, actually, we want to be left alone to do things the way we want to do them. And the second thing is that this edifice of regulatory, the regulatory state depends absolutely on us voluntarily complying with it. And that I think that with the private resources, the private wealth that is out there, I'm not talking about random civil disobedience. I'm talking about using private resources to stand up to the regulatory state through sort of systematic civil disobedience and in de facto nullifying large chunks of the regulatory state because the government realizes it can no longer enforce them. I'll just leave that as a teaser. I have yet to work out the details, but I'm going to start. Yes, we had a question back here there. Somebody had a hand up there. There we are.
I agree with everything that you stated. My concern and what I've been studying is looking at the students' side of the story rather than the parents and the upbringing they come from. I'm from California. California, as you mentioned, is different. Although we had all Californians at this table, so we're okay. When you say that the uppers are going to continue, are you assuming that their children will just kind of mush in and slip into their shoes? Or will we as educators be able to change that pattern if we become more aware of what is happening and we teach it that way? The last statistic I read was something like 60 to 65% of the graduates from colleges across the United States today are not going into jobs that are pertinent to the degree that they hold?
Well, there are a whole bunch of things in your question there that I could talk about. Let me just focus on a couple. One of the things that happens when you have this college sorting machine that I talked about is that you have what's called homogamy, educational homogamy, but you also have cognitive homogamy. And so before, if you were a really successful man, let's say, CEO in your 30s, who are you married to? You were married to the girl next door because you probably got married at the age of 20. Or if you got married later, you married a girl at the country club who is not also, she's not selected for IQ necessarily. However, if you're getting married, if you're a CEO in your 30s now and a male, who are you married to? Probably you didn't get married until 28, 29, or 30, or maybe after that. Who did you marry? You married this Yale lawyer who was litigating a case against your company, and you thought she was really cute. And so what happens is, and this happens on a very large scale, that you have really smart people marry, smart, not just smart, but industrious and hardworking and all sorts of other personality characteristics. They're marrying each other, and they are producing some really sensational kids in many cases. Sensational in terms of their talents. There is one other aspect of them, which is I think many of them are hothouse flowers. I'm not sure what their degree of resilience is, but there's an awful lot of talent there. So in many ways, there's an argument to be made that the new upper class has a cross-generational tenacity that it did not have before. The shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations doesn't apply as much now as it used to, and that makes me a little pessimistic. Your other remarks about college and having jobs that have nothing to do with their college degree, don't get me started. I mean, I am a guy who published op-eds after a book that I wrote about education, op-eds entitled "The BA is the Work of the Devil." So I have a lot to say on that I will not get into.
Hi there.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. You know, you were talking about the low popular culture and approximately 100,000 people.
In the new upper class, narrowly defined.
I work and live on the west side of Hollywood, and I think there's a couple of 100,000. Personal opinion, perhaps you can comment on that. And I think the culture is lower than you allude to. I think that culture is lower than you allude to. Did you hear me before?
Yeah, I could hear you before.
Okay, good. Then I won't repeat that. And it's sort of a two-part question. The late Steve Jobs, was he a genius, an entrepreneur, or just a plain good businessman? Thank you.
I hate being asked questions that I'm not competent to answer. First place, with the 100,000, I was referring how many people are there whose decisions affect the national culture, politics, and economy, and that's a pretty small number. With somebody like Steve Jobs, I think the answer is yes. Well, one of the things about him was, by the way, though, that he wasn't nearly as good in his 20s as he was in his 40s. When he came back to Apple at the age of, in his early 40s, he was a brilliant CEO, whereas he'd been pretty far off the edge when in his first incarnation at Apple. Mm-hmm. We have one down in front. Yeah, we'll take that one back there and then come down in front.
Thank you for your talk. I'm a teacher in San Diego. I'm also a congressional candidate. I make less than $50,000 a year. I've grown up with the advantages that you've mentioned as advantageous, such as mixing with different parts of the culture. I have that in my background. Is that a good background for a Republican, for a conservative to have running for office nowadays?
Perfect. It's the absolutely perfect background. I'll tell you, well, you invited me to pontificate about the Republican Party. If there are millions of people out there who vote Democratic usually, who I think would vote for a Republican candidate with your kind of background, who is foursquare, no holds barred in favor of freedom, opportunity, and free enterprise. The Republican Party has gotten a reputation of being, first you have a whole bunch of fat cats, Wall Street guys, collusive capitalists. I mean, by collusive capitalists, I mean partly crony capitalism, but also all of these business firms which are in bed with the regulatory agencies and are perfectly happy to have regulations that favor them and that disadvantage smaller competition. That's one set of Republicans that are in the public mind, and the other are social conservatives, and I say this respectfully of those of you with socially conservative views, but who a great many people are not going to vote for you, any candidate who holds them, just because of the cultural wars and so forth. I think there are common themes that could unite a great many Americans, and that precisely the right spokesperson for those kinds of views are someone with your background. Good luck to you. And we're going to come down from front here. Yes.
My name is David Stringer from Prescott, Arizona. Dr. Murray, you are perhaps best known for a book written in 1994, I believe, called The Bell Curve, which argued, and I'm oversimplifying, that basically there are significant, meaningful, and enduring differences between racial groups and IQ achievement. And I'm just wondering if you could comment about, given the changing demographics of our country, what does that portend for our future?
You correctly stated what the bell curve said as described by the people who reviewed the book who had not read it. The subtitle of the book was Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. Those two great themes I talked about during my speech, the increasing value of brains in the marketplace and the college sorting machine, that's the book. And in writing the book, we had a chapter on racial differences, because if you're going to generalize this, you have to address all the questions that are ordinarily raised about cultural bias in the test, and IQ doesn't really mean anything, and the rest of that. Race was a trivial issue in the book. There has been nothing that's happened since then that makes me think it is any more important than I thought it was then. And so the answer is no, there's nothing about the changes in demographics or anything else that have much of an effect on anything. But I'm really glad you gave me a chance to reveal what the bell curve was actually about. And if any of you doubt it, you can still get copies on Amazon and you can check it out for yourself. Put it down here. Hang on for just a second. The microphone is on its way.
I'm just curious that nothing was said about the other class in our country, and that is all the government unionized workers that have created a special class for themselves. I think that's causing a great cancer on the way our government works.
I essentially agree with that. And I think that probably some of the most pernicious effects there are felt not at the federal level, they are felt at the local level. I mean, the union contracts that are negotiated by city. You don't, come on, to negotiate a contract, you've got to have somebody who has some skin in the game. And when you have a mayor negotiating with a labor union, it's not his money that he's giving up when he negotiates these contracts, and it has made it really difficult to provide basic kinds of public services that shouldn't cost nearly as much money as they cost. And California, I think, is Exhibit A. You've led, I think, you've been at the cutting edge, as California so often is, in this time in terms of bankruptcies of large cities, because of the kinds of things you're talking about. The difficulty is that, well, it's going to be very interesting. We now have the example of California and the problems that it has created because of, in some part, because of the problem you described. We have other states like Indiana and elsewhere where they have not had nearly as many of those problems. Are we going to have a sort of common sense reaction by the other states saying, we want to go the way Indiana went, we don't want to go the way California went. We are going to find out.
This will be our final question.
Okay. And we have a hand up down. Okay, this is the final question. Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you. You hit pretty close to home when you mentioned Winnetka, Illinois, because that's where I came from. And in my day, Don Rumsfeld was one of my classmates in high school. And his parents and my parents were lifelong friends. We went to New Trier High School. Following us were people like John Stossel, who you currently see on Fox News. But also Cook County, Illinois, Chicago to be precise, Rahm Emanuel, also a New Trier High School
No kidding.
graduate. Yes,
I didn't know that.
Yes, sir. I recognize that this is a unique question, perhaps, but what I'm really concerned about is what we stood for back in the 1940s and 50s has now totally deteriorated into what passes for progressive liberals today. And my question to you is, can we resolve this? Can we overcome this? Can we, what is the solution? How do we reclaim the United States, the freedom, the Constitution, where we're free to live our own lives as we see fit, as long as we don't interfere with somebody else's life, when we're up against this seemingly screaming progressive group that won't even let us get a word in edgewise because they always outshout us. We try to debate and they outshout. So I would be very interested in the solution that you see as to how we come back, how we reclaim our country.
Anita, you went one question too long. Look, here is the reality. The people in this room, including me, we actually do pretty much live our lives as we see fit. Yes, the government gets in our way in certain respects. We pay too much in taxes. We have to go to the DMV to get our driver's licenses. But with more serious problems, if we have a company, we probably have lawyers that can deal with a lot of the government nonsense. And if in our private lives we do have resources that we actually de facto live pretty free lives, most of us. The people who don't are the people much further down the socioeconomic ladder, in the middle class and in the lower working class, for whom the kinds of depredations that the current state puts on really does prevent them in all sorts of ways. Not just from living their lives as they see fit in terms of work, but have had enormous effects on their incentives to form families, on the way their communities operate. I think that the reclaiming has to proceed as follows. Those of us who still enjoy the fruits of freedom have to become advocates for those who do not enjoy those. That we are not taking these positions so that we can get a 5% cut in our marginal tax rate. That we are taking these positions because freedom is not just a right. Freedom is expedient in living a satisfying life. And that we are currently depriving our fellow Americans of doing that. It is wrong. And the reason that we are going to make these changes is not to enrich ourselves, but to enrich our fellow citizens. Once we can start to make that case, we have a chance of winning the argument, as long as it is seen as an argument between the compassionate people and the selfish people. We're going to lose. But we can change the debate, because what I just said about freedom is the truth. Thank you very much.